Hello, and welcome to this week's webinar. Today we'll be talking about a minimal facts versus a forensic interview, and this is going to be part one. So today I'm really going to focus on the minimal facts interview, what it is, best practices for conducting one, and when it should be conducted, among other considerations. So I want to start just by talking briefly about what is a minimal facts interview. A minimal facts interview is exactly what it sounds like. It's just getting that basic information that we need to proceed once we receive a report of child abuse. Typically, a minimal facts interview is completed by a first responder. This could be in the actual event of the disclosure, or it could be following a report that's submitted to the State Central Registrar or Child Abuse Hotline. That being said, minimal facts interviews are typically done by law enforcement officers or CPS. The purpose of the minimal facts interview is to determine if there are other potential victims, for example, siblings, relatives, or even neighbors who may also have been victimized. It's also important to determine if a medical exam is necessary and how quickly we need to get that child in for a medical. Really, a minimal facts interview is going to answer these basic questions: where, when, who, and possibly how. The where refers to where did the event happen, what happened, when did it happen in a general timeline, and who is or are the alleged perpetrators. We want to ask all these questions to best determine if the child is in any immediate or imminent danger, and then move forward to establishing a safety plan. We also want to ask if there is a non-offending caregiver who can transport the child to the CAC for a full forensic interview. Preparing for the minimal facts interview. When preparing for a minimal facts interview, you want to consider a few key points. The first thing you may want to consider is there another resource for the information, such as an accompanying adult? If so, ask the adult, not the child. Asking a child too many questions can make them hesitant to disclose further information, specifically if the child didn't disclose this information that resulted in the report in the first place. Sometimes reports come in because it's observed behaviors or concerns. For example, bruising and other marks on a child's body, or somebody actually observed the abuse happen. If that's the case, you want to go to the person who actually filed the report. You can also gather important information as to what other children are in the home, where they live, or information about the alleged perpetrator from other adults. You may also want to consider what you must know to make decisions about further action. If the information is not necessary for this purpose, don't ask the child. So again, you really want to stick to those who, what, where, and when questions just to get that basic information to find out if that child is in immediate danger. If the child is in immediate danger, you're going to want to create a safety plan for that child. Where will they stay? Who will be their non-offending caregiver taking care of them? And how immediately can we get this child into a child advocacy center for a forensic interview? Point three is to consider what type of questions is the child developmentally competent to answer. Although chronological age gives us a good baseline for determining, we also have to take into consideration their actual developmental state, their emotional state that they're currently in, and whether this child has any disabilities that may hinder them from answering questions. And our last point is, how do I phrase my questions so that they are developmentally appropriate, non-leading, and non-suggestive? It is a good idea to think about these things in advance so that you are best prepared for the interview with a child. The next thing I want to discuss is when a minimal facts interview typically takes place. And a minimal facts interview would take place whenever there is a child abuse allegation. It is best to begin with a minimal facts interview to determine what, if anything, happened. If a child is hesitant or does not disclose any actual abuse during a minimal facts interview, or perhaps the report came in and there is a logical explanation for what somebody actually observed, we may not move any further in the investigative process. When law enforcement or CPS feels that it is necessary, a minimal facts interview will lead to safety planning and then the scheduling of a forensic interview. All investigations differ in some respect, and the approach to the minimal facts interview must be flexible and permit the investigator to use his or her common sense in following the process. When a child volunteers detailed information, that information should be written down or otherwise recorded, and the report should reflect the circumstances under which the child made the disclosure. Take into consideration where the child is. Are they somewhere where they feel safe and supported? Or are they perhaps nervous, withdrawn? Are there other adults around, specifically caretakers or other relatives and family or friends? When the child is not volunteering information, questioning and particularly leading questions should be avoided, and minimal facts should be developed from other sources whenever possible. We don't want to hinder further investigative processes by asking, leading, or prompting questions during a minimal facts interview. Remember, the main purpose of the minimal facts interview is to determine if the child is in any immediate danger. Minimal facts interviews should focus on safety and the assessment of the child's well being, not on the specific details of the abuse. A child may only disclose the most recent abuse that has occurred during a minimal facts interview, especially if it was in the last 24 hours, in which case we may need to consider if that child is in need of a medical. During a forensic interview, the trained professionals will look further into the patterns and history of abuse, how and when it really started, and how long it's been occurring. You may want to talk to the child alone. This is the best case scenario if a child is disclosing abuse. It helps improve their comfort level and gives them the opportunity to talk freely about what they're experiencing. Using open ended questions best helps to avoid leading questions or limited questioning. Using open ended questions gives the child the means to have a free narrative and express themselves. You may want to follow up on something by saying, "Is there anything else?" Or "Then what happened?" Or "Could you tell me more?" Things like this really let the child direct the conversation. And it shows that you are interested in what they are saying. Keep a record regarding questions and answers from your interview with the child. Take notes or possibly record the or the minimal facts interview if possible. This can be used to help direct the forensic interview later on. If there is a spontaneous disclosure, you want to keep a verbatim record of that, using the words that the child uses. This helps you better relate to the child. And when a forensic interviewer meets them, if there are words that the child used to describe different body parts or actions that have occurred to them, they can follow up to get better clarification on what the child actually meant. Lastly, at the conclusion of an interview, you should always thank the child. Thank them for their time, for being willing to talk to you, and acknowledge how brave and difficult the situation likely was for the child. Here I have a flowchart of the minimal facts interview. So when we may start with what happened. The child may be able to tell you where on their body any touching may have taken place and how the child was forced or coerced into a specific action that made them feel uncomfortable or unsafe. We then want to move to the where did this happen? Where helps determine the best jurisdiction and law enforcement agency that should follow up on the forensic interview as well as any investigative pieces. Although a child, it may seem, lives in one jurisdiction, the abuse itself may have happened while visiting family or friends elsewhere. And so the actual perpetration happened in a different jurisdiction. In many cases, law enforcement agencies can coordinate these efforts to best meet the needs of the child and their family. When did the abuse happen? This can include the last or first time and how often the abuse occurred. The most recent occurrence is specifically important if we are concerned about collecting physical evidence through a medical examination. If the most recent occurrence happened too far in the past, we would not want to put the child through the trauma of a sexual assault examination, but we would certainly refer them for a reach exam or to see their physician to make sure that everything is okay. Who is or are the alleged perpetrators? If possible, it's best to know their age or date of birth of the perpetrators as well as where they live. Of course, some of this information will not be available to the child. However, it may be available to their non offending caregiver. If you're able to get this information from the non offending caregiver, that would be in the best interest of the child. You also may want to ask if there are other witnesses and or other victims. Was anyone else present during the abuse or did anybody else experience the abuse? Next, what steps are necessary to assure the safety of the child and other potential victims? For example, will the child be returning home after school to the alleged abuser? If so, it's best to make a plan for how to keep that child safe until the next step in the investigation can take place. And lastly, is there an immediate need for a medical examination? I also just want to note that physicians should not be interviewing the victim. I hope this helped give a better understanding of what a minimal facts interview actually is and how it takes place. Next week, for part two of this presentation, I'll be talking about the forensic interview and how it differs. So I hope that you come back next week to check that out. If you have any further questions, you can certainly email me at Sara at cacfingerlakes.org.